Hey guys, welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews. Today we're taking a look at the Skechers Performance GoRun Razor XS2. Let's run with it. Now before we get started, I do want to say that these shoes were provided to me by Feet First Sports, an amazing locally owned running store in Columbia, Maryland. There's a link down in the description. You get $10 off and free shipping. I personally don't benefit, but it does help a small local business. I'd also like to say please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing so I can continue to make these reviews. Here we go. And if you're not familiar, Skechers Performance sits underneath the Skechers company. Skechers, that we all know, pretty much makes casual or more lifestyle-oriented shoes, while Skechers Performance, that subdivision, makes performance running shoes that are actually legit and can compete with most of the other running shoes out there right now. Now, I got to try out all the Skechers running shoes last year. I'll put the link somewhere up here. And the Razor XS, the first version, the predecessor to this, was my second favorite shoe behind the Max Road 5. And I think the update here is moving in the right direction, so I'm excited to talk about it. The Razor XS2 is a lightweight daily trainer that's rather versatile, but if I had to put my money on it, I would say it's probably more towards the fast end of things, some of those faster daily training runs, just because it is so light, and it does now have an H plate in the forefoot, which stiffens it up just a bit. This $140 running shoe comes in at 7.2 ounces, which is pretty light. However, this is a 0.2 ounce increase over last year, as the previous version was 7 ounces. Now, 0.2 ounces didn't really make a material difference. I didn't notice the slight increase. I was just happy that they kept the shoe light, and I really did feel light on foot, which I really enjoyed. The stack height remains the same, with 30 millimeters in the heel, 26 in the forefoot for the same 4 millimeter drop. However, the midsole does have a different kind of configuration with a different kind of foam. So we got a lot to talk about here. The midsole is still that Hyperburst foam, which, if you're not familiar, is a supercritical foam, and all that means it has a different manufacturing method, which allows the foam in the midsole itself to be much lighter. Essentially, they take a block of foam, put it in a pressure cooker, all these gases get injected in, it expands, create these small cell-like structures. I'll put a picture somewhere on the screen so you can see what I'm talking about, and this really does make the shoe or the midsole be much lighter, and why most of the Skechers shoes, which all do feature this Hyperburst foam, to be on the lighter end of things. While the midsole is still Hyperburst foam, they did update the configuration to make it a little bit softer and bouncier compared to its predecessor. Personally, I did notice this, and it was rather enjoyable, especially through the midfoot to heel section. Once you get towards more of the forefoot, it becomes a little bit more firm, but I really did have a pleasant experience with it and did notice a significant improvement in the bounce and cushioning compared to the previous version. Another big or massive change they made to the midsole was that they included something called a carbon infused H plate, because the plate actually looks like an H. I'll throw a picture on the screen so you can see that H plate, and I'll actually show you what it looks like in the shoe. You actually see it once you take the insert out, and you can see the H plate kind of sitting right below the insert. So what this does is it really does stiffen up the forefoot a little bit. You do get a little bit kind of flex in that towards the top of the toe box, but the midfoot is going to be a little bit more stiff. Now, this isn't as stiff as like a true carbon fiber plate, and maybe a little bit less stiff compared to like a nylon plate like we see in the Speed 2, but it does basically give you a little bit more rigidity through the midfoot section and makes the ride a little bit more smooth and a little bit snappier, in my opinion. And just like last year, we do get 2 foam sidewalls on both the lateral and the medial side. This gives it a little bit more stability. It's a slightly more stable neutral shoe just because you do have a really wide platform and these 2 slightly raised foam guide rails. And the last component that impacts the ride of the shoe is something called Hyperarch. This is essentially the different curves throughout the midsole, a rocker geometry, if you will. This was previously referred to as M-Strike, and they're updating the branding to kind of reflect what that looks like. So Hyperarch, you have the different arcs throughout the midsole, essentially just a rocker geometry. So taking all those different factors into consideration, what did I think of the midsole and the ride that it provided? Well, I quite enjoyed it. I thought it was quite pleasant, and the midsole had a nice level of cushion and impact protection, especially compared to EVA foam midsoles or more traditional foam midsoles. It was a little bit more lively and a little bit more exciting, in my opinion. Now, you really do notice it mostly in the heel and midfoot. It kind of tapers off as you get in towards that plate area or the front of the shoe, and the plate, again, is a less aggressive plate, and that kind of pairs into the rocker story. You do notice the rocker geometry, or that Hyperarch flow of the midsole, or geometry of the midsole. It just is less aggressive compared to other rockers out there. So you do notice it just doesn't have the full kind of tilt effect, if you will, or rocker effect. So I think the best way to describe it is I think this does work well at faster paces. You're able to pick it up, even slow it down if you want, but I think it's more oriented towards faster runs. So it's a less aggressive rocker, a less aggressive plate. It's just not as stiff. It just gives you a little bit more rigidity in the forefoot foot to have a little bit more leverage and a little bit more energy return. It's just not like a true full carbon fiber plate or plated experience in my opinion. So for daily trainer, I think it works really well. I like the bounce out of it. I like how light it is, has a nice flow to it. It just isn't like a true aggressive rocker plated experience. It doesn't have like a ton of thick boosty bouncy foam, but is a nice level of energy return, especially compared to daily trainers with a similar stack height and maybe have an EVA foam setup. So because the shoe's so light, it has all these different properties that kind of make it really fun to run in. I think it does give it a little bit of advantage compared to more traditional daily trainers. Moving on to the upper, this has been completely redesigned, and I'm happy that they did, because last year it just wasn't my favorite. It worked well, it was breathable, but it had more of a synthetic kind of plasticky feel to it. Just wasn't super comfortable, didn't give me a great experience. So here, it's a more traditional mesh upper, incredibly thin. You can practically see right through it, which makes it very breathable just because you have these large mesh holes. They give you a tiger stripe pattern, which kind of gives it a cool element, if you will. But the upper I thought was very breathable and more comfortable compared to last year. Now, the other thing when we have to talk about Skechers shoes or the Skechers upper here is that it's a little bit more narrow, especially kind of in the toe box area and maybe through the midfoot. This works well for me because I do have a slightly more narrow foot, so I had no problem with the fit, but I will say that the upper is going to be a little bit more narrow, so I would recommend probably going up half a size. The tongue is rather thin, has a two-part setup where we get a different material at the top than the bottom. The bottom's kind of like a slightly padded mesh, and the top is like a more soft fabric feel. Now, I really did like the tongue, even though it's non-gusseted, which is a slight downside. I do prefer a slightly gusseted tongue, or at least where it's attached, so it doesn't move. Didn't have too many issues with it, but I do prefer having something to keep it in place. With all that being said though, I thought it worked really well. It has a slight amount of padding to it. It's not quite paper thin or like a race thin, but I think it's a nice level, especially for a shoe that is this light. So I think it worked well, no major issues. As far as the lacing goes, very robust. You do get quite a bit of lace coverage with reinforced eyelets, so there shouldn't be any issue there with the durability. Moving to the back, we do get quite a bit of padding, especially for a shoe that only weighs 7.2 ounces. Now, as far as the lockdown fit and comfort, I thought it worked really well. Again, I think my foot, because it is slightly more narrow, worked well for this setup, but it is going to be more of a narrow shoe. So again, probably go up half a size, but again, with the lockdown, the tongue, the lacing, the heel, ankle, Achilles area, I was really happy with it, and it was very comfortable, especially because they went away from that plasticky upper. The Razor XS2 also features something called Archfit, essentially just a little bit more arch support in that region. It's not like a truly custom support orthotic experience. It's just something I happen to notice, not too invasive, not too intrusive. It just, just something you happen to notice. So I would just keep that in mind. You can remove the insert if you want. There's just, I guess, slightly a little bit more arch support compared to other conventional running shoes. As far as the outsole is concerned, we still get that Goodyear tire rubber coverage throughout pretty much the entire outsole. I will say that the rubber is fairly thin, so we'll see how the durability holds up this year. And as far as the traction goes, I thought it did very well. I tried kind of testing out on various surfaces, didn't let me down. Unfortunately, didn't have a chance to try it out on wet surfaces, but it did work well for me, and I didn't have any major complaints. The other thing I'll say is that it is a rather smooth traction pattern. You don't have any deep lugs, so if you're running on grass or gravel and things like that, it might not be the best, but for road running, it worked well for me. So those are all the basic facts about this shoe. Let's talk about what I liked and what I think could be improved. The first big positive for me was that the shoe only comes in at 7.2 ounces, making it a lot lighter compared to some of its competitors in the daily training space. I thought this was quite nice. It felt very light on foot and was just a joy to run in, especially because it just didn't feel very clunky or heavy. And the last positive for me was the overall ride of the shoe. I thought it was very pleasant. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The Hyperburst foam midsole is going to be more lively compared to some of your traditional EVA foam daily trainers, which are a little bit heavier, a little bit bulkier, and just don't have as much liveliness in the midsole compared to the Razor XS2. And then on top of all of that, the Hyperarch and the plate in the forefoot that was recently added kind of provided a nice nudge towards the the faster paces. Now, it's not a super aggressive rocker, it's not a super aggressive plate, but I think it really does work well and provides a nice fun experience, especially at such a lightweight package, which I think is a big selling point on this shoe. Just feels very light on foot, has a nice smooth transition to it, and feels like you have enough cushioning underfoot, which sometimes if you're going towards the lighter route, you don't always get that. So again, a less aggressive rocker plate, a nice level of cushioning, a less aggressive rocker geometry, feels very nice underfoot, very smooth, and I think does work towards faster tempos. However, the shoe wasn't perfect, and there are a couple things that can probably be improved. The first negative is the fit of the upper. While it worked relatively well for me, I do wish I had a little bit more room in the toe box. My toes felt slightly cramped. I think maybe going up a size would have solved this, but overall I will say that this is a more more snug fitting shoe. So just keep that in mind. I think the sizing just feels a little bit too tight. The next negative or potential negative is the outsole. I think some people had some issues with the durability, just didn't wear as long as they wanted. So we'll see how the outsole holds up here. And I think that's something to keep an eye on, just because I think the first version had a similar issue and the second one here looks to be fairly similar. And the last negative for me, and this is more personal, is the styling. It just doesn't look the coolest. I think the silhouette is cool. The overall shape and geometry of the shoe looks awesome. I just wish they would come out with some better colorways, maybe some different design and overlays. I think would go a long way in helping the Skechers brand. They have great shoes. I think people seem to like them. They work really well. I personally enjoyed running in them. It just might not be, it just, in my opinion, just doesn't look the best. So does that matter? No, but you'd be surprised how many people pick running shoes of how they look. And if you're going out on the town and just want to wear them casually, you probably pick a different pair. So that's my constructive feedback, is I would hope Skechers Performance comes out with some different styling and updates just to make it a little bit cooler, just because they are attached to the Skechers name brand, and that does have a whole set of connotations to it. So I would just keep that in mind. Well, that concludes my review. Let me know what you think of the Razor XS2 and Skechers Performance in general. I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.